Welcome to the Deakin Alumni and School of Psychology webinar with Professor Jennifer McIntosh. Jennifer McIntosh is a Professor of Attachment Studies at Deakin University's Centre for Social and Early Emotional Development. She is also the Director of the Melbourne Attachment and Caregiving Lab, Australian Temperament Project Generation 3 study. Jennifer is both a clinical specialist and researcher, with a particular interest in making developmental theories user-friendly, enabling parents, carers, and professionals to consider the experience of children more sensitively in the context of family trauma. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jennifer. I'll now pass it over to you to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here. So it is my pleasure and privilege to talk with you today about a translational research project called MERTIL, My Early Relational Trauma-Informed Learning. So this is a major project that's been underway, led by Deakin University through the Centre for Social and Early Emotional Development. And it's a project that brings together the latest of our evidence about trauma and the way that it impacts early infant development, together with clinical psychology, thinking and practice, and high-level adult education practices. So it's been a real pleasure to work on this project today, and I'll today summarise some of the headlines for you. So I'll tell you a bit about who MERTIL is, why we are studying relational trauma and why I teach this now, and specifically why teach this to maternal and child health nurses. I'll give you a précis of the MERTIL course and share with you, hot off the press, some of our evaluation findings. Also tell you about two very neat research studies that are running from the MERTIL team, and give you a summation of where we've been before we turn to Q&A. So MERTIL, well, there are in fact two MERTILs. That's me on the left of your screen, and my colleague Professor Louise Newman. She and I have directed the MERTIL project, which was funded by the Department of Education and Training in Victoria. What's really neat, I think, about this project is that it is a statewide initiative, a universal education platform that we've built for the entire maternal and child health nurse sector, and I'll tell you some more about that as we go. The MERTIL team has been a bit of a powerhouse behind the MERTIL project, and the key players are listed there on your screen. I guess what I want to point out is that we've had the benefit of some extraordinary input from research through the Australian Temperament project, through our project advisors and platform build team, including, and not listed on the screen at the minute, Dr. Jade Sheen from Deakin University's School of Psychology, who was really instrumental in helping us think about the look and feel of the online training component. We've also, oh, there we are, there's Jade popped up on this screen. MERTIL also has a long list of expert advisors from all walks of life who agreed to come on board and help us build MERTIL. So let's jump to the core question of why early relational trauma-informed learning. It's a bit of a mouthful. I think that trauma-informed practice is a bit of a catch cry these days. What we aimed to do right from the beginning of this project was to transform that idea into exactly what it needed to be in the maternal and child health context, which was about early relational trauma. And going right back to the origins here, where we acknowledge now decades of research, including our own in the Australian Temperament project, where the determinants of social and emotional development, family trauma and related disturbances of early care rank very highly in subsequent mental health difficulties and social emotional difficulties. So the opportunity to recognise the early signs of relational trauma and respond to them before they take root is something that's very exciting to many of us in the field. So trauma takes many forms, and what we're talking about here is developmental trauma. Developmental trauma. So trauma that impacts the unfolding, the cascading development of the infant brain and the systems that are involved in the setup of social and emotional and cognitive life. So what we know is that trauma in the particularly first 3 years of life, that occurs between infant and caregiver represents a cascading pattern of risk and leads to many complex psychological harms across childhood and potentially into the adult life course. So there are exposures which obviously occur directly for infants exposed directly to traumatic events such as witnessing their caregiver being harmed or hurt. But more likely is traumatic exposure that occurs through caregiving, through the impact that something has had on the caregiver and on their state of mind, as we would say. So there are many developmental pathways that are impacted by these direct and indirect exposures that leave the infant open to ongoing vulnerability to stress as one of the very first things in life that is set up are the foundations of trust and the ability to manage the stress that we feel. So those are skills and capacities neurocognitively that are chiefly informed by the caregiving relationship that the infant finds themselves in the first years of life. So to be cared for by a very stressed or traumatized caregiver can have a roll-on effect to the infant and an effect on their developing capacities to manage and regulate stressful states within themselves. So these exposures have a very strong relationship, very strong bearing on what we see later down the track in terms of adult mental disorder and substance abuse. So you see on your screen there as high as 70% of histories that we take for adults presenting with mental illness and substance abuse difficulties, that we will find in the first 3 years of life strong evidence of early relational trauma. All right. So, chief amongst, core to the concept of early relational trauma is attachment. Attachment being the unique bond of psychological dependence that an infant forms to one or just a few caregivers within the first year and 2 of life. So attachment, as we teach here in the Melbourne Attachment and Caregiving Lab, which runs through the Australian Temperament project and is fed by higher degree students from Deakin University School of Psychology. So in the MAC Lab, as we call it for short, we study the origins of attachment security, which is really a good thing to have in your back pocket, really, as you grow up, and to grow up in a sense of knowing what it is to trust that when you have a need, it will be recognised and met. So if you think about the opposite of that, which would be early attachment trauma, is to grow up either perhaps doubting that when you have a need, it would be recognised or met, and leading in severe enough forms to infants and young children having great difficulties themselves recognising their own states of mind. So early attachment trauma is a really complex developmental risk factor. It is one of the most confounding contexts of growth for any infant, and it occurs during the foundational years, the critical periods of brain and psychological development. When in attachment speak, we talk about attachment organisation and disorganisation. And so to have an organised way of being in your early years with your attachment figures means you really know what to expect from them. And that might give you a very secure base for going about your life and having secure, confident expectations of care. It might mean that you've ended up with a slightly avoidant way of being in intimate relationships, which is still functional, but that you've learned to kind of turn down the volume on your emotional life and to perhaps expect a little less. Or it may mean that you've grown up with to form something of an ambivalent or an anxious way of being in intimate relationships, but still these forms are organised, that you have an organised way of looking at the world and knowing what to expect from it, if you like. However, to grow up with a disorganised attachment means that you don't have a coherent sense of what to expect from the world when you are in need. And that's associated with some really major developmental deviations along the pathway. So in infancy, and again, this is a core topic within the Australian Temperament Project Generation 3 study, which is operating right here in Victoria. So we're studying neurobiological, epigenetic and molecular variations that occur throughout infancy through disorganised attachment pathways. And through to later childhood, where the evidence is very strong for poor social, emotional and relational outcomes by the preschool years and through the primary school years, on into adulthood, where we see with adults who've begun with early disorganisation of attachment, far higher prevalence of personality disorders and stress-related effects on health. So it's all pretty sobering. And as a pathway, the good news is that the vast majority of this is preventable if we can detect early enough the signs of relational trauma and if we can respond in a good enough way. So why now? Why this work now? Well, there's a lot of work going on following the big decade of the brain in the 1990s on trauma and its cascading effects. So that's given us strong impetus to go about teaching and response interventions in the clinical and at the general level of the population. There's also a really strong legislative context to support this now, which I'll run over in a minute, at both state and local government levels, and particularly with a focus on maternal and child health workforce as a chief frontline tool for earliest detection. So that's all led to this impetus for very new trauma-informed focuses within these services. So in the state of Victoria, where of course Deakin sits, there's been a recent and strengthening policy commitment to invest in the early years and to reduce the effects of disadvantage on childhood development. So the Education State Early Childhood Reform Plan and the MERIL Education Strategy were chief amongst those initiatives. And these recognise that quality early childhood experiences in the home environment and access to health services, participation in learning and care programs, such as the Maternal and Child Health Program, all of these things directly influence the child's health and development. And so we need to maximise children's and families' access to these services, especially children experiencing disadvantage from the outset. At the federal level, there have been, alongside this, some wonderful initiatives, including the Council of Australian Governments, who developed the National Early Childhood Development Strategy on investing in the early years. And the vision for that was that by 2020, all children have the best start in life to create a better future for themselves and for the nation. Well, we're in 2018. I'm not sure about the full realisation of that vision by 2020, but I would like to think that the MERTIL program is a strong contributor in the right direction. Of course, then we had the Royal Commission, also into family violence, 2016, which above all confirmed the absolute imperative for the development of universal trauma-informed practices. So, if you think about the maternal and child health nurse sector, so those listening, you would have maybe taken your babies there, your young children there, or you might even remember going there yourself. It's a universal service in Victoria, and other states around Australia have equivalents, and it's absolutely uniquely positioned for primary surveillance and support of the well-being of infants and very young children. So the need was identified to support this frontline workforce, to be aware of, to be alert to be able to assess and to take appropriate action for very, very young infants and children exposed to trauma. So the maternal and child health nurse sector, which you see on your screen here now, spans the state. There are 79 local government areas, and there are currently about 1,400 what we call universal nurses, as well as 200 enhanced nurses who provide additional services, plus a 24/7 telephone advisory service. So these nurses together roll out a schedule of visits, which every Victorian family is entitled to, 10 visits from birth through to age 3.5, plus extra services where they're needed, which I'll say some more about shortly. So, maternal and child health nurses, why target them for additional training? Particularly, this is a workforce it's already very well trained. These nurses are double degree professionals already. They have a good understanding of behavioural indicators of abuse and neglect. But what was found was that they really would benefit from a deeper understanding of relational trauma. And there was no professional development program that would help them to get there easily. So background documents are on your screen there at the bottom. So then MERTIL was developed to help. What we've tried to do through MERTIL is to provide an organised, evidence-based developmental framework from which nurses might learn to understand, recognise, respond to, and where possible, prevent early relational trauma. So MERTIL was designed as a multimedia, online learning and face-to-face clinical skill workshop combo. And I'll go through that in a minute, what we did. It's pretty exciting. So it's multi-layered. It was designed to be a bit like a chocolate box, really, for nurses to dip into and to take as much or as little as they could digest. There's a lot there, and it's certainly something that could keep you busy for a long time. So let's look at the key themes that we've covered in the MERTIL program. So first, again, we switched our focus from trauma-informed practice to early relational trauma. We took a multimedia approach to this, to building capacity in this workforce for earliest detection, so being able to pick up on the earliest signs of something going astray in the parent-infant relationship. Enhancing confidence in nurses to not just see, but to respond. So as most of us would accept, to just screen for problems is actually unethical if we're not in a position to then do something about what we've noticed. So response. And we've got some pretty exciting findings on this coming up. And hopefully to enhance prevention of some of the complex sequelae for parents and infants that flow from difficult beginnings. So what we've tried to do then is to provide this organised, evidence-based framework from which to understand, prevent, recognise and respond. And this is the frame of early relational trauma. Now, this is interesting because, we were asked early in the project, therefore, are we going to train people all about family violence or mental illness or PTSD or whatever? And we said, well, actually, all of it, because early relational trauma pertains to absolutely anything that has the potential to disrupt, distort, or derail a caregiver, that is a parent's capacity to reflect on the needs of their baby and to sensitively respond to the needs of their baby. So it could be coming from any of these corners. And it can happen to anyone, is the more important piece as well. So it isn't specific. Early relational trauma is not specific to any one of these populations sitting under the umbrella. It's relevant to everyone and anyone. Nobody is immune to tough, difficult life events. It happens to everyone. And so what we felt we needed to equip nurses with was a means of recognising the developmental mechanisms of trauma and the signs of trauma that could come from any corner, from anyone. And then to put the healing mirror up to the trauma that they see, to focus on the prevention of further risk through relational repair. So the way that nurses were not just looking, but the way they were using their relationship with parents, which is fundamentally a relationship of trust, to start to push a domino in the right direction, to get some effective approaches going to support vulnerable parents to provide sensitive care to their babies and toddlers right there in the moment. So one of our priorities has been to try not to ask nurses to do more, to find more time from a diary that's already overcrowded, but to use the opportunity they already had face-to-face and in conversation with parents to do something a little different. So I'll go on and describe that. Okay, so MERTIL, as a maternal and child health nurse, what they've experienced this year has been, first of all, logging on to the MERTIL platform. Currently, that's only available to the maternal and child health nurse workforce, and we hope in time that it will roll out more broadly. So through the platform, they've registered and we can track their learning progress, and they get access to 8 online chapters, plus a whiz-bang collection of podcasts, fact sheets. It's a massive library of resources there for them to accompany their chapters. And that's a bit of the chocolate box feel that I was talking about. So once they've done their basic chapters, they can go in and, to their heart's content, listen to all manner of experts talking about their subject expertise, and to read more and to link to other sites and explore. We wanted to build something that was really, respected the way that these nurses work. So particularly in regions where they might spend hours driving from site to site and might like to listen to some podcasts along the way and so forth. That was all followed up by a one-day skills training workshop. So we, in fact, you see on your screen, we delivered 18. As of tomorrow, it's about to be 22, as we've also now started to train nursing students in MERTIL. So a big program in the workshop where we go through cases and look at real footage, hone observational skills and practice conversational skills for supporting and responding to trauma. And we've also done 2 case conferences. Actually, we've done one, and the next one is in about an hour. All right. In MERTIL's library, I gave you a little indication of things that are in there, and including some recipes for self-care. So when you're going to work on the front line of trauma, self-care is a very, very important part of it. And so we've tried to concentrate on ways of nurses being able to look after themselves as they go. Let me tell you a bit about the chapters and the content in MERTIL just quickly. So chapter 1 was about putting development into a relational context. The psychoanalyst Winnicott once said, there is no such thing as a baby. There is only a baby in relation to someone. And so the unfolding of our neurocognitive development occurs critically in a relational context. So anything that disturbs that relational context may disturb those pathways of development. So hand in hand with this, we talk about the significance of attachment relationships. We look at disruptions in early care and emotional interaction that can affect the infant's neurological, emotional and social development with risks for ongoing development. We look at our role to explore and better understand the parents' anxieties and the ways in which they impact infant care. We focus on infants who are in difficult relationships, infants who are experiencing confusion, anxiety and disruptions in their development. And the attachment-related traumas behind these include inadvertent insensitive responses or inconsistent or frightening responses from the people who are looking after them. We explore the development of the infant's attachment organisation as a focus for the nurse's intervention. In chapters 3, 4 and 5, online with MERTIL, we look at understanding parent and child trauma in the background of parents, and we look at major impacts on current parenting and being able to deal with the baby's emotional needs when you're coming from a place of trauma. We focus on disorganised attachment and look at the ways in which this impacts the young child's confusion about caregiving ability, to help them feel secure and to help them learn right from the early days about how to have, manage and resolve stress. And we calibrate the nurses to what security and attachment looks like. That should say ATP G3. This is where the Australian Temperament project has provided brilliant footage from our Victorian study of attachment development in infancy and preschool, which the nurses have been able to plug into and watch the real deal of how security looks. And we look at signs of disorganisation right across the early years. Signs of trauma included also in the neonate. And we distinguish normal irregularities in development from trauma. We teach heavily on the importance of respecting the meaning of infants' behaviour and preschool behaviour, and particularly for preschoolers. This is an era where we tend to refer to them as naughty or, the terrible twos or so forth. There's really no such thing as the terrible twos and naughty behaviour. If you think that all behaviour is a communication and all behaviour is there to be understood and it has a meaning, and it's really the parent's number one job to figure out the meaning of the behaviour. So when a parent's traumatised and burdened in themselves, that becomes very difficult. And the maternal and child health nurse can act a bit like an auxiliary engine to support the parent with that. We talk about being present to what a child might be trying to communicate about their confusion. Okay. Then from detection to response, the next 3 chapters turn from recognising traumatised states to providing a ground for psychological safety for the parent, to enable some higher level processing of affect and trauma and some containment of trust. And of course that all starts with a conversation. So chapters 6, 7 and 8 then focus on conversation. How we have an empathic presence during these conversations to start a healing process. And the more complex of the circumstances, the simpler the conversation needs to be. So we follow that up with our workshop and we practice lots of methods of talking with parents very simply and very effectively about complex trauma. These are brief conversations, and in the maternal and child health context, we've had to teach people how to have these conversations even over the phone. So we aim to enable soothing, regulation and mentalisation about the inner world of the infant and to support motivation to heal. We look at cultural context, of course, very carefully within all of this. And in these chapters, we talk about the importance of supervision and consultation. On your screen now, we list some characteristics of strength-based supportive conversations. And so these are some of the things that we have taught in MERTIL Online and we practice in the skills workshops. The final point there about children in the room, of course, is a very interesting one. So we look at how to have difficult conversations when, of course, there is a baby, toddler or preschooler in the room with you, and the meaning of perhaps asking the infant or toddler to leave the room, which is a very, very difficult piece for nurses to manage, when to stay and when to go. And care for the self. So the hope, of course, of intervention then in early relational trauma is to provide really well-formed and targeted brief interventions that help parents to make a better adaptation to early parenting, to enhance their confidence, their sense of agency, their ability to be emotionally available to their child, to be a secure platform for early attachment health, and to use their relationship with a maternal and child health nurse to do that, to use that person, that relationship as a supportive presence in their own life to enhance their own security, and thus to begin to reduce or prevent disconnected, neglectful, hostile or intrusive parenting. So in 7 and 8, we take this further. We look at the principles of trauma-informed interventions as on your screen here, ensuring, of course, the physical safety of the child and parent, and then supporting and stabilizing psychological security and safety. It's a skillful thing to support parents in the face of adversity, in the face of trauma, and to build skills in the parent in turn to help them keep their own child physically safe and psychologically secure. So these are listed on your screen as they appear in chapters 7 and 8. So amongst it, we emphasize the core elements of support here, which is all got to come from our own posture of compassionate understanding of the parent's struggle. So removing judgment, any kind of judgment, and enabling everyone to step to their own higher ground in being a consistent attachment figure, managing anxiety that they may feel in being with their infant, and focusing on reading and responding to the infant's communications. It's often the infant, him or herself, who will lead the parent very productively out of some traumatic spaces. It's about taking the infant's perspective as our entry point for change. So it's the first step to repair, to help parents who have been missing signals from the baby, from the toddler, sometimes for days or weeks or even longer. So we help them to notice and name the baby's efforts to communicate their own story when they're older through language, but usually through behavior, through gaze, through body posture, and through play. We name the baby's desire for safety and closeness, and we make explicit how non-judgmental babies are. And so with a parent who has the capacity to take responsibility and to reflect a little, often these very short interventions are enough to kickstart a repair process right then and there in the consultation room. All right, so sorry. So that's a high-level précis, a top-tier summary of what we've tried to do in MERTIL this year in only 20 hours of nurses' time, and then to turn to the question of, well, did it work? So we have just, through our project manager, Liz Clancy, and our research fellow, Anna Booth, had some internal evaluation conducted, as well as an external evaluation, which was led by Professor John Turbaroo and Dr. Bosco Rowland. let me tell you a little bit about what we've begun to find by way of the process and learning outcomes. So, through this translational project, again, we delivered these 8 online modules, and we had over 1,400 nurses complete all of the units. We offered 22 now workshops across the state. Oh, we ran everywhere. We ran everywhere. We had a team of trainees, and we had just over 1,400 attendees at this workshop. So that's a lot of people to cater to for 12 trainers. So we looked at program satisfaction right through the course, through the workshop, and then 3 months after the workshop. And what I'll tell you now is on a subsample of just over 500 nurses at those time points. So this is before they began MERTIL. We asked lots of questions about their confidence in recognising signs and symptoms, that is, of early relational trauma, recognising early relational trauma in infants, in parents, in preschoolers, and their confidence in carrying out trauma-informed responses, their knowledge of brief and longer-term interventions, and the extent to which they thought their referral network was adequate to provide them with support. Now, the last thing we couldn't influence through the MERTIL program, but we encouraged the nurses to really go about revising and building their own referral network to support them as they recognised more and more of what was going on. So here you see on the screen quite a few nurses. This is our full sample actually of over 1,400 nurses. Quite a few saying they weren't at all confident or just not confident, particularly in knowledge of how to respond to what they were seeing and knowledge of longer-term interventions. Okay, so hold that graph in mind and then watch how the colours switch after the workshop. So the red is just about gone, and we see a massive growth in confidence through the MERTIL content and workshop across all domains, which is something that has been very, very pleasing to us. And then the question of does it stick? So our follow-up with nearly 600 nurses, we can see good signs, again, that these changes in confidence, enhanced confidence, have remained by and large. So that's very pleasing at a high level. And in terms of overall satisfaction, nearly 600 nurses have told us that well over 3/4 of them have been satisfied or very satisfied with what MERTIL has provided them. Okay, now just to talk about some of the research that's going on with MERTIL, we've done some beautiful qualitative work to complement this sort of big figure stuff, led by Anna Booth, our research fellow. And 2 studies where Anna and I are looking at the nurse's experience of dealing with trauma and really trying to articulate what it's like to be a maternal and child health nurse out there on the front line of trauma and feeling worried about what you're looking at and trying to make sense of it. As well as looking at the growth of these nurses over time in their confidence. And finally, we're also looking at a subsample of parents who've experienced a MERTIL consultation, is what we call them. So, first, the nurses. This is a phenomenological study. I challenge you to say that 3 times fast. And grounded theory study. So we have 20 nurses from right across metropolitan and regional areas who signed up to the study and completed baseline before MERTIL and then after MERTIL. And we've begun with a beautiful descriptive phenomenological analysis, which is really being able to articulate the lived experience of the nurse who is uncertain and troubled by what I do say confidently she, as there are no he's currently, except in managerial roles, uncertainty about detection and or response to trauma. And so that is a beautiful paper that we're writing up now, which really has shed enormous light on, I guess, on the weight that the nurses carry as they go about this work, and which is often a take-home weight, that sits with them, that stays with them beyond, the parent leaving the room. So it's really helped us to think about what we do, what we must do to support nurses both in recognition, detection, response, and self-care. So we've looked through grounded theory at the skills and knowledge that would really help them navigate trauma scenarios, and the hopes, of course, that the nurses had about MERTIL. So in this little sample then, we can see that of these nurses, the vast majority feel that since the MERTIL training, they are more confident in recognition and particularly more confident in response to trauma. So I think the kind of feedback we're getting is, I've been a nurse for 20 years, 30 years, whatever, and I've always been pretty good at spotting the signs of trouble, but I've never really thought that I had much of a role in responding. I just refer them. And if I did have a role, I wasn't quite sure what to do. So it's very pleasing for us to see this evidence start to come in, that the MERTIL training has really helped with confidence in response. Secondly is this beautiful study that Anna Booth is now running with parents who've experienced a trauma-informed consultation with a maternal and child health nurse since the MERTIL training. So we're talking to 20 parents right across Victoria to ask them what it was like to have a nurse have this kind of conversation with them. So these are all parents who have experienced some form of trauma. Think about the umbrellas that I showed you. It could have been anything sitting under those umbrellas, where the nurse really had a go at sensitive detection and effective response through a MERTIL conversation with the parents. So that's a paper that will be prepared for early next year, and it's underway now, and we really look forward to sharing the findings soon. So from the program, we've made some high-level recommendations to government, some of which have already been taken up, that beyond the current period of offering MERTIL, which is through 2018, that there be ongoing access for the nursing workforce and also students to the MERTIL platform, that we could expand MERTIL's library and keep adding to the chocolate box, keep adding resources as we go, that we could find ways of reinforcing MERTIL learning through case consultations and supervision, and that we're now working on possible ARC linkage ideas to join in University Industry Alliance to follow up on the effectiveness of this massive translational effort in various ways. So we hope to keep changing lives. I guess that's the ambitious note to finish on.
If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email Jennifer directly or the MERTIL program. Thanks so much for your time today, Jennifer, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in and participating in today's webinar.